Welcome to this week's episode of Talking Therapy. Talking Therapy is the companion podcast to my YouTube series In Therapy. We follow brave participants on their real-life therapeutic journeys with me. This is part of my mission to break the stigma around mental health, chronic illness, the reality that we all go through challenging times in our life, but having the right tools, the right strategies, the right support can make a world of difference. On this week's episode, I'm going to be exploring some of the themes from a recent episode of In Therapy with David, where we were exploring the idea of suppressed emotions. I'll talk about why working with suppressed emotions is important. I'll also answer some questions around the sort of energy element of anger and why understanding that is important. I'll also answer a question around writing letters. I talked in the episode about writing apology letters that we may not always send, and why would we write a letter without sending it? David has suffered with depression since his 20s, since he had a series of strokes which have had an impact on various areas of his life. But also more recently, he lost his father in the first lockdown to cancer. Several friends committed suicide. He also lost his cat. It was a very difficult chapter of his life, and that initiated him to reaching out and becoming part of the In Therapy series. And in this episode, one of the things we start to talk about is when we suppress our emotions, when we don't metabolize and digest and feel our emotions, some of the impacts that can have. Here's a clip from the episode. I think what's happening is that there's a sort of what feels like an impotent anger and frustration and rage that certain things in your life didn't go the way that you wanted them to go. Yeah. And didn't go the way that you could rightfully have expected them to go as well. You know, there's a sort of unjustness in that, but not feeling it means that it's just sort of left and then you find yourself becoming reactive and irritable about other things in life. And in a sense, you then find yourself in a place where you're emotionally feeling angry and irritable and annoyed, but it also then gets in the way of the things in your life that you might otherwise change and you might progress and might move forwards. And as we talked about previously, the depression almost becomes a consequence of the stuckness of those feelings. So why is it important that we address our stuck and our repressed emotions? Well, ultimately, what you don't feel, you don't heal. When we have various traumas, emotional impacts, things that happen in our lives that we don't deal with, we walk around carrying those things. It's almost like we have a black sack on our shoulder. And each time an event happens that we don't deal with, we put more in that black sack. That sack becomes heavier, becomes a burden, becomes a drain for us to walk around and carry around with us in our lives. The thing that happens though is every so often, it takes a lot of energy and effort to sort of keep that black sack sealed. And every so often something happens that all of the stuff in that black sack comes out. And David's talked about some experiences where he was, on the tube and suddenly just exploded at a stranger, or turned over a table in a bar because he was just suddenly this explosion of anger. We have to learn to feel, to process, to digest, metabolize our feelings. I think it's also worth saying that often depression is a numbness. It's an emotional shutdown. If we look at David's life over the last year, it's almost like there's so many big events that have happened, like the loss of his dad and his friends committing suicide and the loss of his cat. There's almost too much to feel. So actually, by starting to metabolize and process and feel those feelings, we start to shift the depression. Actually, the depression is in some ways our emotional body's way of protecting us. By going into a sort of numb state, it always allows us to not feel the stuff that feels too much. It's like our emotional range just sort of squashes. We don't have big ups, we also don't have big downs, we just feel numb and flat. To really address that, We have to metabolize, to process, to understand, to feel those feelings that have not been addressed and not been dealt with. Also, you can't feel selectively. So when we shut down our anger or our hurt or our disappointment, we tend to also shut down our ability to feel joy, to feel love, to feel connection. So depression is often an absence of connection to our emotional richness and aliveness. When we shut down the negative, or sometimes we get stuck in the negative, but then we can't feel the positive, the stuff that really becomes our sustenance, the stuff that really feeds and nurtures us as we go through our lives. So what did I advise David to do? How can you begin the process of working with your emotions? Obviously, that's a whole big journey, and that's what you'll see David and also Katie in this series working with. But firstly, as I always say, if you can see it, you don't have to be it. Having awareness of what's happening is enormously important. And that's why with David, we're taking the time to explore what is his relationship like with his emotions? What does he believe about his emotions? How does he respond to his emotions? What does he do with his emotions? One of the ways I had him working with that is doing a thought diary or journaling, something I've been doing with Katie in the series as well. By writing down at the end of the day how you feel or how you've been feeling about how you've been feeling or what you've been doing with your feelings and emotions, that alone will bring awareness. Sometimes awareness is alone is enough to create change. It's like we see something in a new way and somehow it takes the sort of the stuckness out of it and it starts to flow and it starts to move. Other times, what the awareness does is it gives us a choice. It gives us ability to recognize, hang on a second, I can see that I'm doing this. Do I want to keep going down this path or do I want to go in a different direction? You'll also see with David that we're working on getting more deeply connected to his feelings and to himself emotionally. One of the tools that we'll be using is mindfulness or meditation. In fact, that's something you'll see both Katie and David working with in some of the upcoming episodes. That the more connected we are to our body, the more we're in the moment. In fact, in many ways, our immediate sensations in this moment, they are sort of our gateway into our heart, into our feelings. The more we come into the moment, the more we can come into our emotions. And that's a big part of why meditation mindfulness, and I talked about this in a recent podcast episode, it gives us some psychological scaffolding. It just like helps to calm things, to settle things, to get us a bit more connected. But it also becomes a way in to beginning this process of metabolizing, processing, digesting our feelings. So I want to come to a few questions about this particular episode. So Jill asked, thanks David for sharing your story. Thank you, Alex. I liked the section on the energy of anger. Could you say more about how we manage our energy? So if you put it through the lens of EFT or emotional freedom technique, all emotion effectively is energy. You think about it from a plumbing point of view, if you have a blockage in the pipes, after a while, all that water and pressure is going to build up. Firstly, it's not going to flow, so it's going to become stagnant, and it's more likely to then have bacteria and viruses and whatever. Do you get viruses in water? You get the point I'm trying to make. But also what can happen is the pressure builds, and then at some point the pipe bursts, it explodes. Going back to my analogy with the black sack, with David, it's the same thing. The pressure builds and builds and builds to the point that suddenly we have that explosion. So we want to work on moving and processing and metabolizing and digesting the energy of our emotions. Learning to connect, learning to feel is a really important step. It's a really important part of doing that. Jenny on YouTube asked, I thought it was interesting when you both made a comment about not sending apology letters.
I understand not sending out regrets or emotional purging or anger letters, but is there a reason why you would not send an apology letter? Be interested to hear more about this. So I'm a big fan of sending letters. So firstly, my point is not that if you have a mess to clear up, someone to apologize to, a situation or a circumstance you didn't handle well, and you want to write to someone or email someone, you should absolutely do that. It's totally a place for that. But I also use writing letters in a therapeutic way, where actually, if you know you're going to send something, you tend to write it differently. There's a sort of different intention, there's a different often messaging that comes out. And what I'm really looking for people to do is connect with how they feel in themselves emotionally. The less it's about sending that letter, the easier it is, like the less kind of contamination, let's say, there is of just honestly owning your words and your experience. And sometimes those letters go for a few iterations, and sometimes you write it with the absolute intention of sending it. You want that person to know, maybe not an apology letter, maybe more of an emotional expression letter. You want them to know how you feel. But in the process of doing it, actually, you sort of realize that you don't need to send it. Other times what happens is you start writing it with no intention of sending it. And actually in the process, you get to something you feel, I really need this person to hear this. And then it does become appropriate to send it. You'll see in an upcoming episode with Katie that this is something that I get her to do with some of the issues with her family. It's actually a very beautiful and healing process for her. Aliana says, how do you access and resolve suppressed emotions? This is the big question. I have touched on this a little bit in some other places in the podcast. The way that I tend to work with this is being in touch emotionally is a natural state. Like feeling our feelings is as natural as being connected, flowing in the present moment. It's how do you get yourself to not feel your feelings? Like, what are the strategies that you use for disconnection? And in the reset program, I talk about the 6 emotional styles of disconnection. Some examples might be avoidance and distraction. Always being so busy and so distracted that you don't really have the time or the space to connect in and to actually feel how you feel. Another being state changing, using sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but of course there's many other ways, be it overworking, be it food, whatever it might be. But constantly trying to change the state of how you feel as, again, a way of avoiding feeling your emotions. So how do you access and resolve suppressed emotions? You look at the strategies that you're using to get away from your feelings and emotions and start to work with changing some of those. And then tools like meditation, mindfulness to become more grounded, more connected. And then literally learning to feel, learning to connect to your heart, to make space for, to allow your feelings and your emotions. So finally, there's an anonymous question that someone sent in. I was wondering what your advice would be for someone who struggles with the therapeutic relationship. I find I'm so afraid of being invalidated that I don't share the things that bother me. While I can play the part socially in many ways outside of therapy, I think therapists find me extremely draining because I kind of freeze or detach when I talk to them. So my recommendation, this was a question that was emailed in, would be start where you are. If that's your history in the therapeutic relationship, that's where you need to start therapeutically. You need to find someone that you feel enough trust with, that you feel safe enough with, that you can start there. You can say, my history in therapeutic work is that I find that I don't share the things that matter. And just by sharing that alone, I think you're sharing something that's very vulnerable. So I think that would be a powerful starting point for a therapeutic relationship. It can also take some time. Finding the right therapist can be, this is not quite the right analogy, but it's a bit like dating. The first person you go on a date with might not be the person you spend your life with. And the first therapist you work with might not be the person that you're going to go the whole therapeutic journey with. So don't make it about you being wrong or you not being able to do therapy. if you have a therapeutic relationship that for whatever reason doesn't feel like the right one. Equally, people can have the opposite problem. They constantly change relationships because everywhere you go, there you are. Everywhere you go, you have the same issues, the same struggles. So it's a real balance, and I think it takes a level of self-awareness to know, is this the wrong therapeutic relationship and I need to move on? Or am I just starting to get to the really challenging work and actually I'm running away and I need to stay and do the work? Can also be a great one to talk through with the therapist that you're working with. So I hope that's been helpful. Just to give you a few reminders of a few things we've just released. We recently released a gratitude meditation on my YouTube channel. Do check that out. We've also just announced our next online conference, the Fatigue Super Conference, which starts on April the 19th, but it's available to register now. 40 of the world's leading experts on fatigue. About half of the interviews done by me. I was also really excited to bring in some of the practitioner team at the Optimum Health Clinic. I think it's our best online event we've produced so far. Completely free to join the sessions each day. If you want to have ongoing access, you can also, for a small price, you can purchase lifetime access as well. We also have been releasing some stories so far on the YouTube channel of the season 1 participants. So do check those out. There's now well over 40 sessions within therapy. So if you want to go deeper into your own work, I think following these stories is a really powerful way to do that. Hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. As always, be kind to yourself. Go gently.